Welcome everyone and happy Mother's Day today. It's such a pleasure to see everyone in on a very busy Sunday evening for the session. And we are live on YouTube right now. We'll be running a short video about our platform and the respected authors have already been there. So. Welcome everyone, and as I just mentioned, happy Mother's Day to everyone here. I'm Neeta Aneja and I'm the founder of Trends Literature Series, and I'm really happy to see everyone taking out time on a very busy Sunday evening. So our 94th interaction under Trends Literature Series could not have been more engaging and interesting. So we have none other than the most respected Mr. Manish Tiwari with us today. He's an author, lawyer, Member of Parliament representing Sri Anandpur Sahib in Punjab in 17th Lok Sabha. He has served as the Union Minister of State in the Ministry of Information and Broadcasting. He is currently the senior national spokesperson of the INC. 10 flashpoints, 20 years, national security situations that impacted India. This book, as Mr. Shashi Tharoor says, is an insightful examination of the challenges that have characterized Indian foreign policy in recent years by one of our more thoughtful political figures. So thank you, Manishji, for joining us today. It's such an honor, such a pleasure, such a...
Good evening, Mrs. Aneja. Thank you very much for having me on your platform. As when you were running your short video, I could see that you've had people far more eminent than I on your platform, but it's always a pleasure to have an interaction, and thank you very much for inviting me.
Thank you, sir. Our privilege, as I mentioned. So the books, definitely I'll delve into the conversation straight away. And for everyone present here, I must say that this book delves into every salient national security challenges India has faced in the past 2 decades, and also dissects responses, both successes and failures to them. So, Manishi, when did you think you first felt the need to write this book? And is it creating the same impact that you had visualized? I know it's already a bestseller.
This book, frankly, came about by accident. I was in the process of writing another book, the book which I'm currently writing, essentially a new security approach for India. And when I wrote the first chapter of that book, I realized that it was bereft of context. So therefore, there was a need to contextualize, because if you write an abstract, then it looks more like a PhD dissertation rather than a book which would engage readers. And so this book was, in fact, is an attempt to give context to the current one. And when we were in the process of deciding that how far back do we go in terms of context, do we go all the way back to 1947? Do we go further than that? I thought that maybe the last 2 decades and essentially India's second nuclear test may just be perhaps the right starting point. And so therefore, we looked at the significant and salient security challenges that we faced since then. Of course, one thing which got missed out and which was pointed out to me by a very esteemed colleague in Bangalore is that the book seems to have a very North India-centric point of view. And the allusion, of course, was to the final struggle with the LTTE, which resulted in the secession or the end of militancy / terrorism in Sri Lanka. But then, as it was not a major security challenge for India in that sense of the word, that challenge was perhaps way back in 1987 when we had sent the Indian peacekeeping force. I had deliberately decided that it would not form one of the chapters of the book. So essentially, that's how this book came about.
Fantastic. And I must congratulate you. It's already creating a lot of buzz and already a bestseller. So is it creating the same impact that you had visualized?
Well, as I've mentioned in the introduction of the book, this book is not really aimed at our practitioners of national security who perhaps know much more than I would ever know, since they've handled that particular remit in government. This is actually an attempt to educate my colleagues in the legislatures who unfortunately are not able to find the mind space and the bandwidth, primarily because our retail politics has become so competitive, in order to really look at the big picture issues which define India. And number two, it is also aimed at the layperson who may have an interest in national security and strategic affairs, but possibly does not really want to go very deep into the intricacies, because obviously, like specialized literature, national security literature can also be very dry and a very tough read. So essentially, those were the two audiences that I had in mind. And I'm happy to note that the book has been well received even in the strategic community. I did not see any major criticism about the book, notwithstanding the fact that practicing and an active politician has written it. And to me, I think that's a great source of personal satisfaction, that even professionals and practitioners of national security feel that it's a book which is well intentioned and serious enough for people to possibly kind of engage with.
Absolutely. And I must tell everyone, it's absolutely engaging once you go through it. It's definitely put downable. And it's been published by Rupa Publications, and you can always find it on all the websites, Amazon, bookstores, everywhere. So you've said, Manishi, time and again that there's definitely a need to focus more and more on national security. And I'm sure that's the reason why this book really came about. And you've also said that we should really rise above all the political lines whenever the challenge of national security comes about. Your book definitely has started a dialogue, and yes, there have been highly polarized responses as well. But uh, why do you feel that we do not really discuss the national importance issues? I mean, something like this, national security issues, together as a nation? And why do you think there's a lack of all party consensus on the issues of national security?
Well, first of all, allow me to state that there are five broad themes which run through this book. The first theme, which and this forms the substratum of the book, and the first theme is that since 1947, India has not been able to break out of its neighborhood, primarily because of the baggage of partition Kuwait Pakistan and the unsettled borders Kuwait China, which continues to create a problem even as we currently speak. Number two, India requires 30 years of peace on its periphery in order to surmount its internal developmental imperatives. And so, therefore, that essentially means that we have to find a modus vivendi with both Pakistan and China. The third theme is that India will never be able to achieve its true potential until the time there isn't a broader integration of South Asia in order to unleash the creative potential of 2 billion people who call South Asia their home. And the essential gridlock in the integration of South Asia is the Indo-Pakistan equation, or the India-Pakistan paradigm. The fourth is that India's defense expenditure is uncommensurate with its national security imperatives. Either we have to substantially ramp up defense expenditure or bring down our national security challenges. The fifth theme is that, for Pakistan, which continues to be our biggest bugbear, uh, everything goes back to Bangladesh and 1971. That's a humiliation which is stamped on the national psyche of their deep state. Until the time they are not able to come to terms with it and move on, unfortunately, we will remain deadlocked in a kind of a status quo. And the final theme is that civil military relations, unfortunately, are a very, very fragile are a very fragile China, which need to be very regularly tended, because, as I have demonstrated from 1947 onwards, there have been stresses and strains, some which we have managed, some which became unfortunately public and ugly. So therefore, under those circumstances, these are the five broad themes which run through the book. And to answer your question straight off the bat, the reason why the debate on national security unfortunately has become so polarized is primarily because the entire paradigm in India is us versus you. So even on critical questions of national security, we are not able to surmount that mindset. And therefore, when I wrote this book, I did not write it as a NDA, Kwe, UPA, Kwe, NDA kind of a book, though I have looked at last 20 years. I essentially looked at situations, our responses to those situations. In hindsight, could we have done better? Where we possibly scored a success, where we failed. And I didn't look at the color of the cat, which was in the office, was in office at that point in time.
No, no, sir, very well written. And you, from your experience, coming from your background, it's definitely a treasure to have. I'll come to a question you've been asked a lot of times, but I need to ask you because we are discussing your book, and this definitely seems to be one of the most important issues in the book, though I know this has been raised particularly. You've written in the book that India should have actioned a kinetic response to the days following the 26/11 Mumbai terror attacks. This statement from the book has definitely been garnering a lot of response before the book was published, even, and after, definitely. So, and you also said that India should have acted strongly against Pakistan after the terror attacks, as restraint against Islamabad is perceived as a symbol of weakness. But sir, why do you think that the response of UPA government was inadequate? And are you suggesting that India should have gone to war against Pakistan when a policy to disengage with Pakistan, with Islamabad and not go to ruinous war to preserve economic growth also has its merit?
Look, let me dissect the question and put it into two buckets. You see, insofar as the media response is concerned, I must say that once again, to me, and since I've handled the information and broadcasting remit in government, underscores the complete illiteracy of the Indian media. So therefore, based upon two or three quotes which my publishers put out, they had one day of fun running their own conjectures and their own theories without even waiting for the book to be released. And it just goes to show the complete trivial nature of the Indian media, which unfortunately believes in sensationalism because they have flawed revenue models. And I can write another book on why the nature of the Indian media is unfortunately the way it is. Having said that, we did not come to 26/11 by accident. After India's victory in the Kargil War, Pakistan inaugurated a rather nasty phase in the proxy war against India. So you had the IC-8 Fund 4 hijack in the December of 1999 as the millennium was turning. That was followed by the attack on the Jammu and Kashmir Assembly, then the attack on Indian Parliament. And then of course you had the largest mobilization of Indian armed forces after 1971 in the shape and form of Operation Parakram. And while Operation Parakram was playing itself out, you had the attack on the Kaluchuk military base just outside Jammu, in which family members of armed forces personnel were targeted and unfortunately killed. And then you had the parallel universe of terror, the Indian Mujahideen and the bomb blast which took place across India, in Sarojini Nagar in Delhi, in the Mumbai train bombings, the Hyderabad Mecca Masjid bombings, and so therefore you had this whole series of incidents, and then 26/11 happened, and therefore 26/11 was an inflection point, in my view, that merited a stronger response. And in fact, many people who were in charge of the national security remit at that point in time, including Mr. Shiv Shankar Menon, and he's written about it in his book, the former national security advisor, Mr. M.K. Narayanan, has also publicly said that coercive options were on the table. But the one thing which this book, which this entire discourse misses out, is something which is there on page 68 of the book, and that is with regard to our response on Operation Parak, with response to our response to the Parliament attack. Now, if India would have taken Operation Parakram to a logical conclusion, and the then naval chief, Admiral Sushil Kumar, is on record saying that Operation Parakram did not have any clear-cut political objectives or even military objectives. And in fact, General Panag, he wrote a piece for the print, and I quoted that. And let me quote a few lines from page 68. I've written, as a matter of fact, no strategic aims or end state were debated or set down in terms of either territories to be captured or any other form of capacity degradation. Admiral Sushil Kumar, the naval chief up to 31st December 2001, has stated on record that no political military aims were articulated. When he sought the rules of engagement post-mobilization, that is post-Operation Parakram had commenced, the then Prime Minister replied, "Mobilize for the present and the rest will follow." The essential question is that if Operation Parakram would have had clearly defined aims, and we would have actioned those aims, then maybe 26/11 wouldn't have happened. But these are, conjectures of national security situations which are extremely fluid and evolving. And so therefore, yes, and that's why I have written that once we came to the 26/11 inflection point, I've never suggested that we should have gone to war. All I have said is that the response should have been kinetic. But then somewhere in the book, I've also said, in fact, at 2 or 3 places, that the successor government, did action a kinetic response in terms of a surgical strike, which of course, are shallow border operations which have been going on since 1998. There is this nasty business of head cutting which goes on the LAC and the international border. But the NDA BJP government took public ownership of it. And then you had the Balakot airstrikes. But the question that we need to ask ourselves still, has it brought about a significant change in the behavior of the deep state of Pakistan? Because that is the end objective of a military operation, in order to bring about a change in their behavior. And I'm afraid the jury is still out on that. It has not happened.
So very right. And you've time and again said also that you've always propagated the fact that there has to be peace on the periphery. But tell me, sir, can we have peace with a country which is at war with itself? I'm talking about Pakistan here.
Look, if we were to rewind to the events which have taken place since the April of 2020, when the Chinese decided to transgress across a whole broad frontage into what we claim is our territory, Pakistan chose not to take advantage of that. In fact, given Pakistan's proxy war and given their behavior profile going all the way back to 1975 when they inaugurated the strategy of leading India with 1,000 cuts, uh, it seems illogical that why Pakistan did not take advantage of it. And the reason that I believe they decided to exercise restraint, and to some extent, this was also confirmed by one of their serving generals in a track 1.5 in the October of 2021, is primarily because they've come to a conclusion that if they want the Chinese monkey off their back and they want to distance themselves from the Americans and start evolving as a normal state, they would essentially need to have or make peace with Pakistan and with India. And that seems to be a recurring theme which runs through the articulations of their various army chiefs, General Rahil Sharif, General Bajwa. And so therefore, there seems to be a movement among the corps commanders to kind of revisit the proxy war that they have been unleashing since 75. And then, of course, it became much more vicious when they became the recipients of huge amount of arms and ammunition when they became a frontline state in the Afghan jihad. So I think that is something that is not being appreciated enough, and that there seems to be a window of opportunity. And I think there is eminent sense in trying to have a structured re-engagement with Pakistan.
You're so right, because you've been watching India's foreign policy for so long, and I would say, an expert on this. And do you think that India's policy towards Pakistan not to have a dialogue is correct?
Well, I think it's a policy of no returns, because if you go into the genesis of any conflict, the Americans were fighting the Viet Cong, but they were simultaneously talking in Paris. And those talks went on from 1968 all the way till 1975 when the Paris Accords were signed. Concurrently, you have this horrendous conflict playing itself out in Ukraine. But the Russians and the Ukrainians continue to talk. First of all, it was in Belarus, then in Istanbul. So therefore, communication hasn't broken down. Eventually, if you look at the history of warfare over, let's say, a 5, 6, 7 century perspective, it's very rare that you've had outright military victories. More often than not, a battle which has claimed millions of lives has also ended on the negotiating table. And so there is nothing to be gained by not talking to Pakistan. And in fact, given the fact that both India and Pakistan are nuclear states, where the missile flying time is less than 5 to 7 minutes, in fact, in certain cases, even 3 minutes, any kind of a misunderstanding can have inadvertent consequences. For example, the launch of the BrahMos missile recently, which landed in Mia Chunnu in Pakistan.
Yes.
It could have had unintended consequences. For example, the publicly available information states that the missile actually flew through airspace, which was very heavily populated by civilian aircraft. God forbid if a civilian aircraft or something had come down, and if that civilian aircraft would have belonged to Pakistan, we would have had, we would have been in a new paradigm, absolutely. And so, therefore, it is extremely important that given that both countries are overt second-age nuclear weapon states, we need to have a dialogue at multiple levels with Pakistan.
And so in the book, you've also mentioned about CDS, and it's been months that our government has not appointed a CDS in place of late Bipin Rawat. And there's also some raised doubts about the need of CD, for a CDS when there is no impairment in our defense preparedness. Worse, I think CDS was seen as a political appointee that could hurt the non-political character of our defense forces. So Why do you think we need CDS? You've been talking about it,
Well,
that we definitely need it.
in fact, the CDS debate is not new. You see, the CDS debate was actually inaugurated formally by the Kargil Review Committee, which was headed by one of India's foremost and very distinguished um, strategic thinkers, Mr. Subramaniam, the current foreign minister's father. And so, therefore, in that report, there was a specific mention about the need to create a chief of defense staff. And in fact, the armed forces had been articulating it for a while earlier, because before we had the chief of army staff, or the COAS, or the chief of the staff's committee paradigm, you had the army chief being called the commander in chief, etc. But when the government made the announcement on 24th of December 2019, in fact, that evening itself, I wrote a piece for the Outlook and then followed it up with another piece for the Hindu, parts of which find reflection in this book, that government does not seem to have really thought it through. And the Department of Military Affairs, which is staffed by service officers, rather than have a larger reform of integrating service headquarters with the Ministry of Defense, which they continue to be attached offices, there seemed to have been an episodical or a knee-jerk halfway house reaction. And those apprehensions now seem to be unfortunately coming through, because post the unfortunate and tragic death of General Bipin Rawat, the government obviously has been dithering. And maybe there is some serious rethink about the need to have a CDS, because if it would have been an institutionalized thing which government would have thought through, then obviously the logical thing would have been, after a certain respectable period of mourning, you would have had a CDS. But this long delay seems to suggest that there is possibly rethinking within government about the merits of actually appointing the next CDS.
Yes, there's been substantial delay in this, and I'm sure you have a point there. You've had long interactions with Chinese leadership, including Xi Jinping. But tell us, what do the Chinese really want from India? Why have they amassed something like 80,000 troops at the periphery? And what will really make them go back? Coming from you definitely will make, clear a lot of our doubts.
Look, the one thing that we need to understand is that both India and China came to their respective liberations from imperialism from two different routes. While India got independence as a consequence of a pacifist, non-violent struggle, the first of its kind, which is, or maybe even the last of its kind, which has ever happened anywhere in the world. The Chinese actually got their independence, and then subsequently the civil war between the nationalists and the communists, through an extremely bloody process which commenced in 1921 and finally culminated in 1949, when the communists led by Mao Zedong were finally able to capture Beijing. Now, the years from 1949 onwards till Mao's death in 1976 were extremely ruinous for the Chinese. So you had the Great Leap Forward, which resulted in millions and millions of civilian deaths. And then you had the Cultural Revolution. And it was an era characterized by extremely idiosyncratic behavior, for the lack of a better word. After Mao's death, and when the Gang of Four, which was led by Mao's wife, was dismembered, and Deng Xiaoping took over, Deng tried to reverse that entire destructive 4 decades of China's developmental trajectory. And Deng Xiaoping had then said that China needs 30 years of peace on its periphery to consolidate itself internally. And between 1979, when China opened its economy to the world, and 2012, when when Xi Jinping actually takes over as president of the People's Republic of China and general secretary of the Chinese Communist Party, China saw unprecedented prosperity, double-digit growth for decades. And so, therefore, as of today, there is a 5:1 differential between India and China across the spectrum. And then you've had the Xi presidency, which decided that since China has now built up its internal capacities, the Chinese no longer need to be restrained. And therefore, he's inaugurated an aggressive policy, not only towards India. I mean, Kuwait, Taiwan, Kuwait, the claims that they have in the South China Sea, the claims that they have in the Sea of Japan. So, therefore, China has acquired a very outwardly aggressive posture, if I was to use that word. And unfortunately, this aggressive posture is only going to become far more robust because this Ukrainian war is not going to end well for Russia. And Russia, unfortunately, ultimately, will be forced to become a junior partner of China. And that's why in a recent piece, I had said that there's a new iron curtain which is descending across the world. And behind that iron curtain will lie the states of Russia, China, Iran, perhaps even Turkey and their myriad satellites, Pakistan, Syria, North Korea, Myanmar. Now, that's a decision that India needs to take. That does it want to be the company of these totalitarian states, or does it really want to be in the company of liberal democracies, howsoever imperfect and hypocritical their behavior might be? And in my estimation, our hedge against China lies in India right-sizing its position on Ukraine currently, which unfortunately is skewed. And number two, I think the alliances that India has tried to cultivate, or going all the way back to 1991 when we had the economic reset, there is a need to consolidate that. But of course, we have to engage on the principle of Indian exceptionalism, safeguarding our national interest. And there lies the nimbleness of Indian diplomacy and statecraft. That would we be able to navigate this quagmire?
So yes, I mean, coming on Ukraine, and you've just talked about and given us your thoughts, and I've also been following it, that you've been actually a little bit critical of Indian position and demanded that government of India should support US and its allies. But do you think UPA government would have backed Ukraine despite a long-standing relationship with its physical precursor, Soviet Union?
I didn't for the moment suggest that India should back Ukraine. When you talk about India's historic relationship with the Soviet Union,
yes,
we forget the fact that Ukraine was also a part of the same Soviet Union.
Yes.
So therefore, the relationship between India and the erstwhile Soviet Union is not really confined to its successor state, Russia, but also extends across the erstwhile Soviet Union paradigm, which encompassed Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, Moldova, Belarus on the European side, and Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Turkmenistan, Tajikistan, in Central Asia. So therefore, I think there is a myopic understanding when we talk about India's historical relationship with the erstwhile Soviet Union. Having said that, what I'm saying is that on certain issues where your values as a liberal democracy are tested, for example, the resolution condemning the alleged human rights violations which took place in Bucha and the other suburbs of Kyiv, in my humble estimation, there was no need for India to abstain from that resolution. So that's why I've said that we need to right-size our position on Ukraine. I have not for a moment suggested that we blindly, jump onto the American bandwagon, because that has its own pitfalls. But going forth, if you keep India's strategic interests in mind, I think a very, very myopic view of where India's strategic interests lie is unfortunately being taken.
And what do you think we as India need to learn from this Russia and Ukraine war? I mean, it's been going on
Well,
now for 3 months.
what we need to learn is don't take peace for granted. You see, the Europeans, after the Second World War, essentially took their peace for granted. And all it took was one Mr. Putin to shatter the long peace of Europe. Of course, you had the Balkan conflict in the late 1980s, going on till 1992, but that was more in the nature of a violent reordering of Europe, which was taking place post the collapse of the Berlin Wall. And while some countries actually parted more amicably, like Czech lands and Slovakia, others like Yugoslavia, unfortunately, went through very, very bloody and atrocious civil conflict, which consumed lots of lives. But in the case of Ukraine is different. In the case of Ukraine, there clearly is an aggressor, and the aggressor is Russia. And there clearly is a victim, and the victim is Ukraine. I think that's the reality which we need to recognize. And the takeaway for us, India, should be that you cannot take peace for granted. As they say, that eternal vigil is the price of liberty, because were the Russian invasion were to succeed, it's going to embolden a lot of other people around the world to try similar misadventures.
So on this note, I will like to move on to my interactive round. I have a couple of more questions in case time permitting. I'll come back. We're very privileged to have Mr. Alok Lal with us. He's the distinguished former IPS officer, acclaimed painter, MTech gold medalist who retired from the top echelon of Director General of Police. He's in fact received 2 medals from the President of India for his distinguished services. And he's the best-selling author of the Barabanki Narcos and Murder in the Violence, which he's written along with his son, Manas Lal. Congratulations. Welcome, Mr. Alok Lal.
Hello, Neeta. Hi.
Yes,
Good evening, Mr. Tiwari. It was a pleasure listening to you about your book. And one thing that has happened in this session is that I've decided to lay my hands on this book as soon as I can. There is a question which I often think about. India's foreign policy, the fundamentals of it, were laid down by Pandit Jawaharlal Nehru. And if I may say so, the fundamentals continue to be the same. Not much has changed as far as fundamentals are concerned. But the domestic policies and the philosophy of the government of the day must have had over the years an impact on our relationship with our immediate neighbor in particular. I guess that during the time of the more liberal prime ministers like Atalji, followed by Dr. Manmohan Singh, we tried our best to present the best possibilities for having stronger and happier relations with Pakistan. But in today's context, when the domestic policies are heavily dependent on painting at least one neighboring country as an irritant, as an enemy, can we have similar kind of attitudes? Because if this enemy is not there, much of the internal projection or the internal narrative will also become milder, if not completely lost. What do you have to say about that, sir?
No, I think you have a point. I was deliberately trying to keep this discussion as apolitical as possible. But I do see the point that you are making. However, the one thing which, in my estimation, this government has not unfortunately grasped in the past 8 years, that there cannot be any economic development without social harmony. Money is a coward, and money goes to the safest harbor. And when all international investors read in the Financial Times or the Wall Street Journal, or for that matter, the South China Morning Post, is stories about sectarianism, hate, bigotry, violence, tension among communities in India, it has a completely detrimental effect on your ability to be able to really lift the standard of living of 1.34 billion people who call India its home. But there is a silver lining. Let us not forget that Prime Minister Modi, notwithstanding whatever the disposition of his administration is internally, did make an outreach to Pakistan also. From Kabul, he did go to Lahore and then onwards to Rawalpindi, and had made that gesture to Pakistan. Unfortunately, Pakistan, as expected, reciprocated with Pathankot. And even after Pathankot, for the first time, we allowed a joint investigating team consisting of, ironically, even ISI officers access to Pathankot in order to try and convince them about their own perfidy. Unfortunately, it did not work out. But the fact remains that as Prime Minister, if you look at the larger picture, and if you feel that your primary responsibility is that the 1.34 billion people who are a part of your remit, irrespective of your ideology, are your first responsibility, then I'm afraid, you will not be able to alleviate their standard of living if you continue to be in a continuous in a continuous state of strife with both Pakistan and China. You see, 43 questions of mine on China since the September of 2020 have been refused by the government, primarily on speculative grounds of national security. Now, if you can't take the Supreme Legislature into confidence about what is going on on the borders, unlike Mr. Atal Bihari Vajpayee's approach during the Kargil War, at some point in time you will have to also answer, how much has been the financial cost of sustaining troops, for 18 or 20 long months in huge numbers, in such inhospitable terrain. So therefore, I think if one was to take a realistic view about where India's priorities should lie, I think the logical course of action would be to try and normalize. And I think Prime Minister Atal Bihari Vajpayee, who came from a similar ideological disposition, actually realized that. And Prime Minister Dr. Manmohan Singh, who, despite being criticized as being soft on Pakistan, was perhaps the only Indian Prime Minister who never went to Pakistan for 10 years as Prime Minister, also followed through on it. So I think this is a policy which realism dictates. And if we were to abandon it, on the altar of an ideological bias, we do India a great disservice.
Thank you.
So in our relationship with Pakistan, especially, I feel that the aspect of internal security and external security are very closely linked. You can't take one away from the other. Your response to this?
Well, I agree. Because undoubtedly we have been at the receiving end now for 4 decades of terror, which is sponsored, financed by Pakistan. So therefore, I completely agree with you. And then there is the Kashmir dimension, which the Pakistanis keep harping about, because there is a domestic political constituency in Punjab, the Mirpuris, whose conscience is salivated by the continuous references to the independence of Kashmir by every political party and every military dictator in Pakistan. So those are, realities that we have to contend with. So, but interestingly, India has increasingly become less of a domestic issue in the politics of Pakistan. And if you were to plot the corresponding index in India, Pakistan continues to have a greater preponderance, possibly as a bugbear. We have a saying in Punjabi, Kenati, nu sunana nu nu. So, your target is somewhere else. You're aiming somewhere else. But this is not going to end well, even in the short run.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Alokji. Now we have Mr. Deepak Koot. He's a career banker. He's worked with a couple of international banks globally and currently works for one of the big fours in treasury consulting based in the Middle East. Hello, welcome.
Hi, Neeta. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, hi. Nice to see you again. And Manish, good afternoon to you. And I must say, I must start by saying that I haven't read your book, but I guess listening to you, I'm definitely going to read it because I've always wanted to know more about some of the flashpoints that you mentioned in the book. Now, the book, as I understand, is all about security situations that have impacted India in the past and mention about the external threats to national security. Now, from past and external, I would like to move into the future and internal. So when we look at the current situation in India, one cannot help but notice the religion discourse has taken the center stage, leaving aside other burning issues. Now, I'm not looking for a political response to this because what I'm looking for really is, I want to know your view in terms of whether is there a likelihood of another so-called inflection point in future because of what's happening today? And would this build up to a national security threat if this is not answered? I mean, if your answer is yes, I would like to know why and how it can affect our national security. And if the answer is no, why do you think it would not?
Well, that's a very, very profound question, and I must thank you for that. To answer your question, we'll have to go all the way back to 1947. So when the partition of India takes place, there are three things which emerged from the partition of India. One is an Islamic Pakistan, and two were two competing visions of India. One vision which believed that notwithstanding a religious partition, India should be a liberal, inclusive, pluralistic dispensation. And it should be that sky under which everybody, irrespective of their caste, color, creed, faith, region, religion, will have equality of opportunity and equality in terms of furthering whatever their objectives were. And the second vision believed that since we had a religious partition and it led to the creation of an Islamic Pakistan, there essentially should be a Hindu India. And so while the former vision held the field for 7 long decades, 2014 became that inflection point where promising inclusivity and development to everybody, the current dispensation came into office. And unfortunately, they didn't live up to that promise, and they've kind of pursued a politics of slow burn, of polarization, of trying to keep communal temperatures on a boil. And that's a self-defeating strategy. As I earlier said, that if you really want economic development, you need to prioritize social cohesion. If there is going to be social disharmony, you will not have money and investment flowing into the country, which India desperately needs. If you have to grow at 8 or 9%, that's the minimum in order to try and emancipate the standard of living of millions and millions of people who call India their home. The real danger is that when you talk of minorities in India, you're not talking about 20%, right? You are talking about 200 million people. That is the population of, that's more than the population of many countries on planet Earth. And if you keep pushing people into a corner, you do end up creating a huge internal threat for yourself. And it is a tinderbox. You see, at what point in time it really sort of catches fire. God alone knows, and I wish that never happens. So I wish the government realizes that this is a strategy of no return, and they actually walk that extra mile in order to bring about that social cohesion, which India desperately requires now more than ever.
Right. So in your view, I think what you're trying to say is that the national security threat should be addressed. It could lead to it, and it should be addressed. That's what you're saying.
It could become a potentially devastating national security threat.
Right. Okay. Thank you very much. Thanks,
Thank
Manish.
you for joining in from Dubai.
Thank you.
Yes. Next, we have Mr. Sushil Poddar. He's the Commissioner of Income Tax Mumbai, and he's written a book called Blaze along with his wife, Nidhi, again by Rupa Publications, Blaze. Most welcome, Sushil ji.
Namaskar, Manish ji. First of all, let me congratulate you for authoring this brilliant book. And in my view, the timing of its release could not have been better. Because in the changed geopolitical situation post Russia-Ukraine war, there has been a realignment of various countries in the backdrop of weakening United Nations. So I think people would be more interested to read this book because the content of the book is contextual. My question is different. The 10th flashpoint of your book talks about the dormant Kashmir, the dormant volcano of Kashmir, if I'm correctly wording it. Now, why do you say the Kashmir volcano is dormant? Do you think post abrogation of Article 370, the active volcano has become dormant? Is it the reason? If yes, then do you think this dormant volcano is going to become active in days to come, and in what way? Thank you so much.
Well, thank you very much for asking that very profound question. And I can assure you that I did not organize the Russian-Ukrainian war to sell this book. That happened despite my book. So be that as it may, on Kashmir, let me take a step back. I think the original sin in Kashmir got committed, and I've referred to it in the book, in 1953, when we arrested Sheikh Abdullah. And that became inadvertent, subconscious inflection point in the mind of the Indian state. And after that, I think a kind of an unspoken decision got taken that we will hold the territory and the people don't matter. And since 1953, the broad approach of the Indian state towards Jammu and Kashmir, continues down that path. 2019, on the 6th of August, 2019, inaugurated a new chapter in that particular saga. And that is the abrogation of Article 370 in a manner which I consider to be completely illegal. In fact, I had the privilege of leading the debate on Kashmir on Article 370 from the opposition benches. And I continue to be counsel for one of the parties which has challenged the abrogation of Article 370 in the Supreme Court. And so, to my mind, the way it was done was completely and absolutely unconstitutional. Number two, it is bizarre that first of all, you decide to denude a state into 2 union territories. And then at some point in future, you decide to promise it statehood again. It defies all logic. But more importantly, the sense of alienation and the sense of drift, unfortunately, has only got exacerbated. It has not brought about any reconciliation between those people in Kashmir especially, who, for the lack of a better word, are considered to be hardliners, and the Indian state. A reconciliation which was actively attempted by successive governments over a long period of time. If you would recall that the first official dialogue between the Hizbul Mujahideen and the government of India was actually held under the aegis of Prime Minister Mr. Atal Bihari Vajpayee and Home Minister Mr. L.K. Advani. Majid Dar, who was the deputy commander of the Hizbul Mujahideen, was actually given safe passage in 2001. And his interlocutor was none else than Kamal Pandey, who was the Union Home Secretary. And the conversations took place at the Nehru Guest House in Srinagar. Now, Mr. Vajpayee or Mr. Advani were not less hawkish because they came from the same ideological stable. But I guess somewhere there was that sense of realism that eventually we need to move past whatever is the baggage of the past. And in that context, when Dr. Manmohan Singh decided to follow through on the template which was put in place by Prime Minister Vajpayee in terms of Insaniyat, Jamhuriyat, Kashmiriyat, by having this extended dialogue between Ambassador Satyendra Lamba and Mr. Tariq Aziz, which finally resulted in the 4-point formula, which unfortunately then we walked back upon because we thought President Musharraf didn't have the political capital to be able to sell it after the last Lal Masjid siege. In my estimation, is the correct way to proceed, because you see, when you have an alienated population and you have a younger population which is getting radicalized because of access to radical material, thanks to the internet, is now more readily available, that access is more readily available. It does not augur well for India. And I don't think that you are permanently able to repress populations which continue to be in a hostile mode. And that's why the title of that particular chapter was the dormant volcano. There's a shortage of time, but otherwise, I'll be happy to have this conversation offline. If you ever come to Delhi, give me a call, come and have a cup of coffee with me. I'll be happy to continue this conversation. As someone who comes from a border state which went through militancy between 1980 and 1995, who's looked at Kashmir very closely over the years, it remains a subject of more than academic interest to me, and I would be very happy to continue this conversation.
Thank you so much, and wishing you for the success of the book.
Thank you.
Manishi, we have two more questions. If you have time,
please go ahead. Please go ahead. I'm sorry I gave long-winded answers.
No,
I'm possibly getting old in.
No, it's such a privilege to listen to you. I mean, we've been always been, all of us here have been always been in awe of you. Yes, Reena. She's a managing director of Greeneyes Solutions, and she's a multiple awarded women entrepreneur in solar field. Yes, Reena.
Ma'am, you're muted.
I cannot hear you. Can you unmute yourself again? Reena, we are unable to hear. I think in the meantime, we'll get Mr. Vijay Shankar. He's an advocate at Delhi High Court and Supreme Court, and he's interested in literature and history. And Reena, we'll wait for your voice to come back. Yeah, please remain in the frame, please. Yes, Vijay.
Good evening, sir. Many, many congratulations on your book.
Thank you very much.
Sir, I have one question. Like, we have had very long and very old relationship with Israel. In fact, several decades back, since several decades back. But we became overt about it only after quite some time. So why are we so apologetic about our relationships with Israel?
Well, I don't think we are apologetic about our relationship with anyone. And there is a context to the whole relationship with Israel. If you were to go back to 1947, the UN partition plan for the state of Palestine before the British mandate expired in 1948 envisaged a two-state solution. An Israeli state for the Jews, especially given the fact that they had suffered this horrendous Holocaust in which more than 6 million Jews were annihilated by the Nazis between 1936 and 1945. And of course, a state of Palestine, which was in fact in existence at that point in time. And Jews and Palestinians sort of lived in great harmony till about the time when the Second World War commenced. Unfortunately, that two-state solution never got implemented. And so therefore, India's commitment to the entire Palestinian question, as it is called, I think made us take a position like it did make many other countries take a position, which was not to recognize the state of Israel till the time the two-state solution did not come into existence. And that continued to hold the field between 1947 and 1992. But notwithstanding that, we had some periods of active cooperation with Israel. So when Morarji Desai was Prime Minister, General Moshe Dayan had, who was the head of Mossad, had visited India. I do recall that even during Prime Minister Mr. Rajiv Gandhi's tenure from 1985 to 89, there were substantive interactions with various Israeli officials. And in 1992, with Prime Minister Narasimha Rao at the helm of affairs, and in a changed global order after the collapse of the Soviet Union and East Europe, we decided to kind of establish formal diplomatic relations with with Israel. You know, I think India, historically and civilizationally, has been extremely sensitive to the suffering and the plights of the Jewish community. In fact, the oldest Jewish community in the world was possibly resident in India, you know, going back all the way back into a couple of millennia. So I don't think there's any diffidence with regard to Israel, but yes, our commitment to the Palestinian homeland still continues to be our official foreign policy stance.
Thank you so much, sir. I'm looking forward to read your book.
Thank you.
All the best for your book, sir. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Vijayji. We have Reena back with us. Reena, yes.
Yes, good evening. Manishji, can you hear me?
Yes, I can, ma'am. Please go ahead.
Well, first and foremost, I just want to thank you for what a wonderfully written book. And it shows your political acumen and experience. It really shines through. But what today, the questions that I want to ask you today is about related to your being a spokesperson for a political party. So here goes my question. After reading the book, this is what my question was. As a spokesperson, it seems like the spokesperson position is like a bird whose wings have been clipped, helpless, hopeless, because of non-clarity, policy paralysis, on reactions to be communicated to the Indian media or the populace. Now, so my question is, in the matter of 2611, why did it take you so many years to proactively clarify your stance on the matter? That's A. B is, did you ever directly question the powers that were and express your concerns? Is there any record of it? And the third aspect of the same question is, do you think that in matters of foreign policy, there needs to be some bipartisanship or tripartisanship for a general parameters of responding to unprecedented, foreign policy matters?
So let me answer the questions one by one.
Right.
Number one, insofar as what is the role of a spokesperson, you know, since I have been the spokesperson of the Indian National Congress now from 2008 till currently, which is 2 and 12, 14 years. And I was spokesperson for both government and cabinet. Right, your job as a spokesperson is to try and convey the position which your party or the government takes. It has no place for any personal predilections. right? There is an institutional decision, or there's an institutional understanding which a political party or a government arrives at. Your job is to convey it. Your job is to give the rationale as to why the position was arrived at. And your job is to defend it, right? So if that is if you are in government, or if you happen to be from the ruling party. If you are from the opposition, your job as the spokesperson is to critique what you think are wrong policies which are impacting people at large, or positions which the government takes, which might be egregious, which may lend themselves to a situation where it is detrimental to larger national interests. So that is essentially the role of a spokesperson. He's only the face, or he or she are only the face of an institutional understanding which an organization arrives at. I think there needs to be clarity about that. Number two, insofar as 2611 is concerned, I was not in government, but on the 28th of November, when I addressed the media from the AICC podium, I had officially, as the Congress spokesperson, called for kinetic action with regard to Pakistan. And so therefore, there's a record that exists about it. It is in the public space. If you Google it, you'll find it. Maybe it is also there in one of the annexures or the footnotes to my book. But yes, definitely. That was my position then, and that was my position. That's my position now. Number three, why did it take me such a long time? Because I didn't write this book earlier. Had I written this book earlier, I would have kind of written the same thing. And number four, did I kind of confront the powers that be? The answer is no, for the simple reason that I was not a part of the national security team, which was charged with the remit of handling such a situation. So therefore, there was no occasion whereby you could have maybe articulated a viewpoint beyond what I did on the 28th of November 2008, which is on record.
And the last section is it, do you think that in foreign policy matters, there can be any kind of partisanship with other parties to have some general parameters in case there is a response that is required overnight? All of a sudden we're attacked, or we need to attack.
You see,
can there be some kind of understanding? Do you think that we have a mature enough political consensus on this?
See, again, there are two different situations. You are talking about a tactical response, and you're talking about, let us say, a more structured position which the government takes. Now, for example, let me take you back to 9/11. So when 9/11 happened, the United States of America actually came together, and they launched Operation Enduring Freedom against Afghanistan, which went on till 2021. When they had to leave under rather ignominious circumstances, to put it very mildly. But immediately after 2001, there was an extremely polarizing debate in the United States of America, both on America's involvement in Afghanistan and subsequently America's involvement in Iraq. It led to multiple bipartisan commissions getting appointed to look at whether the US approach to both these conflicts, was the correct approach to pursue. So therefore, foreign policy or national security is not a holy cow. It is not an altar that we have to worship at. I think there are critical questions which concern not only the fate of nations, but the fate of people who make up those nations, which need to be deliberated and debated. So therefore, I, for one, have always considered this entire talk of multi-partisanship on foreign and national security policies to be a bit of a humbug, for the lack of a better word.
Thank you very much. Very well answered. It's been a pleasure listening to you.
Thank you very much. Thanks for the great questions.
Thank you.
Ma'am, I'll have to run. I have a day job also, which is to appear in the court. So
I'll send you a few questions. I understand, and giving us so much of your time. It was such a beautiful session.
Thank you for hosting me. It's been a wonderful experience, and I wish you all the best for your platform and for many, many more people to come on to this platform. Thank you very much once again for inviting.
Thank you, Mr. Manish Tiwari. It was a pleasure to host you today. And thank you, Rupa Publications and Geetu, the entire team for